The last mobility item I would like you to be aware of and see how it's configured is what we call anchoring. So remember, my WC home is supposed to be in a DMZ, and that's the DMZ controllers where I want to send all my users that are guests, for example, in my network. And I don't care where they are associated from. You know, if they're on 30 or 40, I just don't want them to be in my network. I want to send them to the home controller. And because I don't want roaming, by the way, that's why the mobility group name is different between these two, because I don't expect them to roam. There is maybe not even an access point on WC home. It's sitting in a DMZ, ready to take the traffic and releasing this traffic to the internet behind my firewall. So that's what anchoring is about. So the way you configure anchoring is, of course, you have to have controllers know one another. So I have to have home into WC30 and vice versa. So this configuration has to exist. Group name can be the same, but recommendation is not to have the same because there is no reason why. They should not exchange about roaming. You know, it's separate. So group name is typically different, although, you know, there is nothing that mandates that, but it's just a recommendation. Then if you go to your SSID, and I create a new SSID that would be of a web type of authentication, for example, let me call it with a very original name, guest and guest, and let's enable it and go to security, set no layer 2 security, go to layer 3 and use web policy for that SSID. Okay, that's a guest SSID, fine. So what I need to do is to configure that SSID here, and the thing is that SSID has to exist exactly configured the same way on the other side. There are a few changes that can be there between one side and the other, but the SSID has to be the same. The global configuration of the SSID also has to be strictly the same. Few things can be different from one side to the other. One thing can be the interface you choose, management or something else. The other one can be the radius you choose. So there can be a few changes, but otherwise all configuration has to be identical. So then once you have your SSID created on both sides, you go back to either side, let's start with the foreign, the one that is inside my network, and go to the WLAN tab, and when you're here, you go to the end of that line of your SSID that you want to anchor, you hover over this blue chevron, and you see there is this mobility anchor function. You click it, and here you define where you want to anchor that SSID. And of course, you're going to point to 129.10, which is the home controller. And if you click Mobility Anchor Create, you're saying, I want traffic coming to that SSID to be always sent to .10. So it doesn't stay here, it's tunneled all the way to .10. And the thing is, you also have to go to that home controller and apply the same configuration, meaning you go to the SSID, you go to the end of the guest line, you go to Mobility Anchors, and here you see you have the option Local as well, and you click that option and you click Mobility Anchor Create. So that tells this home controller that it is terminating a tunnel coming from the foreign controller. This is key, and that's something people forget very often. They just configure one side and not the other. But if home does not know it's supposed to receive traffic for guest from 30, it's going to refuse it. So be careful, that has to be configured on both sides. The other thing you have to be very careful about is configuration. If there is any mismatch in the configuration of the SSIDs between the two sides, except again the interface and or the radius definition, you know, where the authentication is going to happen, but everything else has to be identical, because if there is any difference, the tunnel simply will not form. Because when 30 is going to send traffic to home, they are going to look and compare their SSID configuration to decide if it's the same SSID. And if there is any change, any difference in the configuration, they will conclude that these are two different SSIDs, and therefore there shouldn't be any tunnel, and your tunnel is going to fail. So for example, if I go to advanced and I check the HTTP address assignment on one side, I must go to the other side and check the same box. You don't have to do that, right? But if you do that, it has to be done the same way on both sides. Because if you forget one side, the tunnel will not form, even for a small item like this one, and basically it's not going to work. So be careful, configuration has to be identical. The interface and the radius, of course, can be different, because the real authentication is going to happen on home. 30 is going to receive the traffic and it's going to simply tunnel it to home. So home is the place where real authentication is going to happen, and that's also where you're going to send people out to the interface. And this is why the configuration for AAA servers or radius servers and also the outgoing interface can be different, because basically the configuration you have for those two on the 30 controller, the foreign, does not matter. What matters is what you have on home, because this is where the tunnel is going to end, and this is where the real things are going to happen. You know, where you're going to authenticate people, where you're going to call reducers or use the local heap, and also where you're going to send people out. So this is where you need to define what is the guest interface that you want to use. That guest interface may not exist at all in 30, and it doesn't matter because it doesn't need to have it. The traffic is going to be tunneled from 30 management IP address to home management IP address in this mobility tunnel, and client traffic is only going to appear for real in the network once you get outside of home. If you configure that, you may change those numbers, mobility anchor config, which is the keep alive that 30 and home exchange with each other to decide that they're still able to talk to one another and that there's still a possibility to create a tunnel. You can also assign a DSCP value to those exchanges. Those default values are typically okay, except if you have some WAN connection between these two and you may have some losses in packets and you may want to extend those numbers, but typically those numbers are okay. Once I associate a client to that SSID, and you see I have one here, it's associated to guest, on the controller foreign, I see its MAC address, and if I go to the home and I look at clients, the client appears as well. It's the same MAC address. So you see once the tunnel is up, the controller is going to forward traffic to home, and you see on home, what I see as being the access point is in fact the IP address of the controller, 30. And it's because you see that the AP is in fact the other controller IP address that you know that there was a tunnel from 30 to home. If I look at home, the access point is the real access point the client is connecting through. So that difference, the fact that you see the client on both sides, but the access point is different, is a clear way for you to understand that your tunnel is working properly.